please join me in welcoming the Honorable Kel Seliger and the Honorable Kirk Watson. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Happy to have you here.
Thank you very
sir.
much.
Happy to have you on the end there. Thank you for being here, both of you. A great topic to talk about at any time. Mr. Chairman, is higher ed, in a very broad sense, sufficiently funded in Texas? Broad sense.
Is it sufficiently funded? Sort of depends on who you talk to.
I'm talking to you.
Well, if you talk to people in higher ed, it's emphatically no.
Yeah.
In general appropriations, $14 billion went to higher ed.
Right.
Last year, which is a substantial amount. Quite frankly, I advocated for more in formulas.
Yep.
And for more in Texas grants, which is our biggest scholarship program.
Right.
And we got more money in there, and substantially more money. But it's sort of a team effort. Everybody needs to do their part. Certainly the legislature, but also the institutions in the way the priorities they set and the funds that they allocate.
And of course, we're going to get to that. I guess I'm just asking, in a broad sense, the total amount that they get, is it enough given the challenges and opportunities that higher ed faces institutionally in the state?
Are they funded enough? I'm not prepared to say that they're necessarily underfunded. Can we do more? Yes, but I think we ought to get more too.
Out of it. Senator Watson, are you prepared to say whether there's enough money going into higher ed?
Well, what I am prepared to say is probably not. And I think when you look at things like the very good goals that have been set by the Higher Education Coordinating Board with the 60 by 30 techs, what I would love to see our state do is something that we don't do. And that is take something like that and ask the question, how could we do it right? How could we do a Marshall Plan around something like that?
Yeah.
Because of the benefit that it would bring to our state, not just to the individuals that it would benefit, but societally what it would benefit, economically, all of those kinds of things, and get out of the habit that we tend to get into in Texas, where we start with, what's the minimum we can do? And I think in higher education, we still do a lot of that. We ask, what's the minimum that'll get us by, or what's the average? How can we do the average? And it would be nice to say, what would maximum look like? Now, we may not be able to do it. We may not be able to afford it. There may be a lot of reasons you can't do it, but we don't engage in the discussion about how do we maximize benefit and then back away from that if necessary, as opposed to what's the minimum we can do, and we'll try to add to it when we can.
Do you agree that with Chairman Seliger when he says that the state is putting an enormous amount, I don't think you used the word enormous, but it's a significant amount.
It is a significant amount.
A significant amount of money, that the state's contribution to higher ed is significant?
It's significant when you look at just raw numbers.
Right.
But when you start asking the question, is it significant, at the same time we're asking higher ed to do more?
Yeah.
When you look at and then you ask a couple of other questions. Look at 60 by 30 techs and look at what our future needs will be.
Right.
Or when you look at the past and you ask about where we are, where we rank on college attainment worldwide, or even in the United States, you have to ask if we're we over a 30-year period, our college attainment rankings have dropped from 3rd or 4th globally to 23rd or 24th. Well, when you look at that, you have to ask, well, yeah, it's a significant amount of money, but is it what we want it to be, and could we do better? Could we, again, is there a better outcome? Yeah. And I'll put it in one other context. When you're asking, or when you're saying we're going to deregulate tuition so that we don't have to put more money in it, then you have to ask, are we doing what we ought to do?
You wanted to jump in.
Let's look at it from this perspective.
Yes.
If you look at the state of higher education in the state of Texas, it is in large part very good to exceptional. And I'm talking about things, the plan at Texas A&M to increase engineering majors to 25,000. Look at new engineering programs at places like University of Texas Permian Basin and West Texas A&M. Remarkable attainments. The number of young people who are the first generation of their families to go to college, these things are being done not in spite of state support. It doesn't exist in a vacuum here.
Yeah.
And so we're in this together, and quite frankly, the state of higher education, look at the performance of community colleges and how many people it's bringing into higher education. It's exceptional, but again, it's not being done in spite of state support.
Well, in fact, the debate that's broken out over higher ed funding, as I was saying to some of our guests before we started here, is really not a debate over funding of community colleges, even though a very high percentage of students who end up going on to some kind of post-high school education do go to community colleges. In fact, the community college tuitions in this state are low enough that I think we're second cheapest among the 50 states in the country.
I think so.
That is not what Dan Patrick is mad about. That is not what you're mad about. That is not what your hearing was about. We're talking really about 4-year. And on the 4-year front, so let me try to pivot over to that. On the 4-year front, Senator Watson mentioned the past. I tried to figure out if there was a consistent set of statistics on how funding from the state has dropped to higher ed over the years, and they're kind of here, there, and everywhere. I'm going to pick one.
It's very frustrating.
I'm going to pick one. At UT Austin, the percentage of state support in the university's budget fell from 47% in 1984 to 12% in 2014.
And I would say that that institution is a bad example. And the reason is because that system has so much money that it can do pretty much whatever it wants in that institution. A better example would be Midwestern State.
Okay, up in Wichita Falls.
Yeah, independent university and run, I think, very efficiently and has had great leadership.
Right.
I think that's a better example. One of the
So
things,
well, if it's a better example, help me understand how it's a better example. So what is the contribution?
because they have no other
The state's
choice.
contribution over a 30-year period has dropped, risen, what is it?
Well, I think it's dropped.
Yeah.
But here's the point. We have a competitive situation there.
Right.
There are a lot of priorities.
Right.
When I first came into the legislature, healthcare, Medicaid was about 23% of the budget. Now it's
Right.
about 37%.
Yeah, arguably it's at the top or near the top of the state's budget.
Very close.
Line items, right, yeah.
And so we have to make those spending choices. We can through one means or another raise taxes, whatever it takes to fund everything and increase state funding. I don't think that's what taxpayers in the state of Texas want.
Right, but and as you correctly point out, any dollar allocated to higher ed is a dollar not allocated to something else. It's not higher ed versus not higher ed, it's higher ed versus public ed, it's higher ed versus transportation. You all have to make those hard choices, I acknowledge. But you also understand that at a time when the state's share of contribution to higher ed is dropping, the population of the state is increasing. I was curious in that 30-year period, let's accept that the UT example may not be the best one, where the state's contribution to funding to UT's budget went from 47% to 12%. In that same time period, the state's population increased by 2/3. So higher ed is being asked at a time when the population is increasing, when there are increasingly more kids who want to go on to a 4-year or a 2-year or some kind of education after high school, at a time when those numbers are going up, the state's contribution to funding to higher ed is going down. Help me understand why that's not optically, if not literally, a bad thing.
We are increasing the number of institutions, and when you look at the merger of Pan Am and University of Texas Brownsville,
Right.
we are also creating more seats in higher institutions as our population grows.
Yeah.
We're increasing funding to higher education, increasing funding for scholarships.
Specifically, Senator Watson, if I understand these numbers correctly, something like there have been 500,000 additional students added to higher ed. I want to find the exact number here. It's like 500,000 students added to higher ed since 2000, new enrollees entering the system. I mean, the population of students is no doubt growing, and in fact, if higher ed were up here on stage with me, what they would say to Senator Seliger is, you're asking us to do so much more with less.
And I think that's right.
Yeah.
And I will say that the chairman, he gets that, and he talks about it a lot. So this is not a counterpoint to his,
Yes.
but let me put a fine point on what it is you just mentioned. We are seeing growth in the population in higher
Right.
ed. In fact, we are encouraging it and working very hard to achieve that. We need to do that in order to maintain our state. What we're also seeing is that in the pipeline, we're seeing those people that are going to college now, a higher percentage of them are economically disadvantaged.
Right.
And if you look at folks that know about this stuff, they will tell you that the number one, sadly, they even say it that way, sadly, the number one factor in determining an outcome in higher ed is going to be whether or not you're economically disadvantaged. And 60% of the kids that are in K through 12 right now that are in that pipeline are economically disadvantaged, and we're seeing an upward trend. So when you add to your statement about the population growing,
Yep.
and then you add to that the fact that that population it's economically disadvantaged, our challenges are bigger. I would argue that what that means then is when we say to the universities and colleges, we say we need you to do more counseling. We need you to do more of the work necessary to get these kids through. We need to be providing them the resources in order to achieve those goals. Otherwise, we're going to be on the same trajectory downward.
Chairman Seliger makes a very good point. Do it anyways. Chairman Seliger makes a very good point about the fact that these dollars are finite in the state budget, that you're having to make choices. The unrestricted portion of the state budget really has three big buckets: public ed, healthcare, and higher ed. Largely, those are the areas that you are in competition, and if there's bad times and you have to cut, you cut where the money is. Kind of the old Willie Sutton argument, right? So maybe the problem here is that higher ed hasn't made a good enough case for itself.
Well, keep in mind the institutions also have an obligation.
Yeah.
And because they have sources of funding outside state appropriation, are they spending those dollars as efficiently as possible? Right. John Sharp at A&M makes a very good point through things like private-public partnerships and things like that. They've affected a lot of savings. Where did the savings go? Do they go to better faculty? Do they go to the scholarships and things like that? Where does that money go? And all those institutions are, like any other state-supported organization, there's a requirement on them to operate as efficiently as possible.
But I guess, Chairman, the point I'm making is that higher ed is in there fighting for every dollar it can get at the time that the legislature writes the budget, as is public ed, as are all the other priorities. Is higher ed simply not making the case for itself sufficiently? Is that what's going on here?
They make a very good case. It doesn't add to the number of net dollars going into that.
Doesn't change the end amount.
Doesn't change.
Senator.
I want to say a couple of things. One is, I want to at least get on the record that a slight disagreement with the presumption that we just don't got no money.
Right.
We are a very rich state that has the ability to do more in a lot of areas if we were willing to do it, and I think we ought to at least be willing to recognize that if we set politics aside and we said what's the best way to do certain things, we would be able to come up with more money. Now, the problem with it is we all know the environment in which we work, and people have heard me joke about this before, that every time you go into a legislative session, there's only two ways to look at the budget. One way is to scream bloody murder, we're broke, we can't fund anything. The other way is, someday we could be broke, we can't fund anything. And that's the way you go into the budget. Right. But then what happens is we look at higher education, which is, as Kel says, overall we're doing a lot of things really well. And one of the things that's being done pretty well is, let's talk about the University of Texas for a second. Of public flagship universities, of the 15 public flagship universities you look at, they're 14th when it comes to tuition and fees. When you throw in appropriations and AUF, they're 15th. So we're also doing pretty well when it comes to tuition and those kinds of things. Right. What bothers me a great deal is this discussion that we need to force additional cuts in places without the argument about how we would we make up those cuts. And of course that's become the big debate. Right now there's a big discussion about tuition. Right. And I don't know what everybody expected in 2003 when they said we're going to deregulate tuition. The reason it was done was so the legislature wouldn't have to put money in. you were going to see an increase in
Well,
tuition.
and the purpose, Senator Watson, of deregulation was for the campuses to have the ability to raise tuition. It seems pretty straightforward to me that if you're going to deregulate tuition, that was to give the campuses latitude, responsible latitude, but latitude, was it not?
Yeah, absolutely, and to make it easier for the members of the legislature
Right.
who wouldn't have to, so they could say, we don't have money.
And while that is
Without
true-
without imputing the motives of the legislature that you all did this because you were too cowardly to put, in essence, you were too cowardly to put money in yourselves, or didn't want to do the hard work of putting money in yourselves, so you pushed it down on the universities. Was the point not, Chairman Seliger, in deregulating tuition, to give those campuses and those systems latitude to raise tuition?
I wasn't here in 2003, and so I assume that's exactly it. But at the same time,
Neither was I, so we can impugn all we
Right,
want.
we impugn away.
what would it have been though? Why would they have done it but for that reason?
That was the reason.
I assume that was the reason to give them that latitude.
Right.
But what nobody anticipated is that in that period of time, tuition has gone up 147%.
Right.
But instruction, funds to instruction, only 65, which raises the question, how is the money being spent?
Yeah,
That's the question.
I've seen the lieutenant governor's backup materials to his statements of the last couple of weeks that were out of control on this. That it's 147% increase. I thought it was an interestingly chosen phrase. Academic charges, total academic charges, have gone up since 147% since 2002. Where median household income has gone up only by 32%. I thought that was also an interesting comparison. His point is basically the cost of higher ed is going up 5 times faster than salaries, than what people are earning. Is that the right conversation to be having? Are those the right goalposts?
It is the right part of a conversation to be had. It is not
Right.
the conversation.
You have heard, as I've heard, that in the years since tuition was deregulated, the rate of growth of tuition is actually slower than the rate of growth of tuition when you all had your hands on it before, when it was regulated.
Uh-huh.
Does that weigh into this conversation in any way?
Clearly contradiction in one that we
Yeah.
need to address.
Yeah.
But I'm concerned about going back to a strictly deregulated or a strictly regulated system,
Right.
because then it can make tuition or increases in tuition something simply to be lobbied.
Right.
I'm opposed to that.
Yeah.
That's why I did the bill that passed the Senate
Yeah.
on performance-based tuition increases.
Right, and you're going to bring that back up in the next session.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll come back to that. Isn't what the lieutenant governor is calling for effectively a re-regulation of tuition? Isn't he, by saying to the universities, hold on, we don't want you to do this, he's basically using the bully pulpit to do it. But isn't he effectively setting the table for re-regulation of tuitions with what he's saying?
I think the table was set, I think Kirk would agree with me, the table was set by the general sentiment of the Senate in the last session.
Except Schwertner, Senator Schwertner from Georgetown put a bill up that would have indeed re-regulated, and he couldn't get the votes in the most conservative Senate in the history of Texas, full stop. The votes were not there to re-regulate tuition.
Because we had a better option, and that is performance-based tuition increases,
Right.
not just some sort of blanket re-regulation to just put it subject to the whims of the legislature.
Senator Watson, doesn't this sounds to me like like there's a call here effectively to re-regulate?
That's what it sounds like to me. I've not had a chance to talk to the Lieutenant Governor
Yeah.
one-on-one about it, but knowing some of the sentiment, and that's what it sounds like to me. And what bothers me about that is that it seems, and Kel just implicit in part of one of his answers was saying it seems that what we're doing is we're focusing on one tree. We're not looking at the entire forest.
What do you mean by that? The
Well,
forest would include state funding. It
The
would
forest would
include
include
tuition.
what we're asking the universities to do, what our goals are,
Right.
what our goals are, what our current status is in terms of the pipeline of kids that are going to have certain needs.
Right.
And so what happens is if you just focus on one tree, we're not having the full and complete
Well,
debate.
in fact, in fairness to the Lieutenant Governor, and we'll come to this in a second, I want to ask
and
you
I'm
about
trying
these
to be
things.
very fair to the
No,
Lieutenant
in fair to the
Governor.
Lieutenant
Let me
Governor,
be
the
clear.
Lieutenant Governor actually enumerated specific things that he wanted to see happen, that he believed needed to happen in terms of performance by universities to access additional dollars. And I want to come to those. Let me ask as a practical matter. You told me you just had a son graduate from University of Texas at Austin just a couple weeks ago. Was that too expensive, that time he spent there? Do you think UT cost too much?
Do I think?
Again, using UT as an outsized example in every conversation piece. Did it cost too much?
I am very, very fortunate that I was able to afford that tuition.
But that's not,
realizing
but respectfully,
that's
that's not
the
an
case.
answer to, yeah, that's not an answer
Okay,
to the
but I'm
question.
gonna get there.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm very fortunate. Do I think it costs too much? Surely it costs too much for a lot of people. University of Texas per semester now is right at about $6,000.
Right.
Trust me, I know.
Yeah.
At the same time, University of Texas Permian Basin is about $3,700. Is that too expensive? Absolutely. For some families, that is
But
too
you're a
expensive.
believer in free markets, Senator. Do you believe that the product that people are paying for is justified by the price, or that the price is justified by the product?
Do I think there is value for the dollar in higher education in Texas? Absolutely, I do.
Right. Senator, do you think UT Austin costs too much? Do you think that across the board tuitions at public universities across Texas are justified by the product?
Well, look, you always want it, let's start off. You always wish it would be cheaper because it would make it easier for more to
Well, we'd all like it to cost
So-
nothing, but that's,
yeah,
that's
right.
like
Let's start
unicorns
with
and
that.
fairies, right?
But
yeah.
it depends on what standard you're looking at. If you look at where we are on a national basis, you know, it's Texas public education, in public higher education, it's still a good deal.
In
by
fact,
comparison.
30 states, Senator, this came up in the hearing of
Mm-hmm.
the public, 30 states in this country have higher tuition for public universities than the state of Texas.
That's right. And if you look at debt, you know, issues of debt. For example, again, using the University of Texas as an example, they have fewer kids borrowing, and the amount of debt tends to be less than the national average. If you look at kids, you know, the median family income in Texas is what, you know, mid-50s. If you look at kids, kids at the University of Texas in families with under $60,000, so right around the median income, you know, those kids, they're paying almost nothing, and they're actually getting some additional money for books and things of that nature because of tuition set-asides and other grants and those kinds of things helping pay for it. So under those circumstances, you could argue that, you know, before we run headlong into saying that we're doing wrong and that there needs to be big changes that could really change the way we provide higher education in terms of funding, we ought to ask, are we really doing pretty well? And I think by most standards, we're doing pretty well.
No, he's absolutely right.
Yeah.
But we can always do better.
Sure.
Ultimately, the legislature has got control, as Kirk pointed out in an ed I think he wrote for the trip. And that is, we have ultimate control based upon how much money we put into formulas and how much money we put into Texas grants, which now totals about $750 million. But we're all in this together, and how can the institutions do better as well?
Yeah, I guess when I ask you if UT Austin or any of the schools in Texas is a good value, I really am thinking about this question divorced from how an individual family in the Permian Basin or in your district in Bastrop, say, might feel the effect of this. I mentioned earlier, as I do by rote, where you all went to college. Do you know what tuition and fees at Dartmouth College is this year, Senator?
Yes, I do.
$65,000. Do you know, I know that if you knew that I was going to ask you about Baylor today and it was only going to be about tuition, you would have said, I'll take that deal, right? Do you know what it costs a year at Baylor right now?
I have a son at Baylor, yes.
$54,000. So are you prepared to tell me if UT is a sixth or a seventh of what would be paid at your august institutions?
Do I think it's a sixth or seventh
of the quality?
Do I think Dartmouth is 6 or 7 times
better than
UT? Of course I do.
Really? They're going to run you out of town on a rail. You keep saying that.
And a lot more than just 10% better than Baylor. But
I mean, you understand the point I'm making, that there's a general problem of higher ed costs a lot, full stop, right?
everything has a price point.
Right.
As I pointed out, and I had this discussion with a very nice lady down at Houston Community College who stood up and said, my son goes to Texas A&M, can you reduce his tuition? And the answer was, yes, ma'am, tomorrow, not before. How's your son doing at A&M? Very well. I can call and I'll bet I can get him at West Texas A&M or University of Texas Permian Basin, reduce that tuition by 30, 40, 50%, and he'll get a really good education. But did he transfer? No.
No.
And those are purchasing choices too.
Right. And, I mean, and that's really what it comes back down to, that these are purchasing choices. This is a product. And again, on some levels, I'm tempted to ask, if we're all capitalists, we're all free market people, if the product can command that cost, if the quality of it is high enough, why are we arguing about whether the cost is too high?
The reason is because there's a great public interest in having an educated population and workforce.
Right, but couldn't the pushback on that, Chairman, be if there is such a great public interest, and if higher ed connects to so many other aspects of life in Texas, you all have effectively cut funding of higher ed at the state level. You're sitting on the tuition conversation with the public. What do you want them to do? I asked the chancellor of one of the university systems this week in anticipation of this conversation, if the state doesn't increase funding or put back in funding for higher ed, if they make it so that you're constrained on raising tuition, what's the outcome going to be? And this chancellor said, we're going to have to cap enrollment. We can't do everything that we're being asked to do, given the rate of inflation over the years, given the growth of the population of the state, given the growth of enrollment in higher ed. You're asking us to do too much. The math doesn't work.
At the same time, we're increasing funding in formula. We increased funding about 60, 70 some odd million in Texas grants.
Yeah.
We made a substantial increase in the higher education funding, which goes to the non-AUF schools.
Yeah.
We're not increasing it as much as the institutions would like.
Right.
Quite frankly, I think that some institutions maybe should cap enrollment and concentrate enrollment growth where the increments don't cost as much in some of the other institutions.
Senator, I want to address the chairman's point specifically. Last session, you all increased appropriations to higher ed by $282 million. Is that right? Is that the number?
right.
Is that the number that came up? But in fact, if you drill down on those numbers, state support per full-time student equivalent has actually declined since 2003 in actual dollars by about $500 per FTSE, and adjusted for inflation, you're actually spending about $1,700 less per FTSE. So for all the talk of increasing, the effect has actually been in the reverse direction.
I mean, in fact, if you look at, for example, the Texas state system, you know, we did, about 9% increase in the formula last session, but when you take into account increased enrollment and the weights and all that play out in that, for Texas state system, it ended up being about a 1% increase.
Right, nominal at most.
When you look at Texas grants, for example, there was yes, indeed, last session we put more money into Texas grants, but Texas grants is still providing less per student than it was providing before the 2011 budget cuts.
Yeah.
And now they're talking about spreading it even more so
across more students,
across
with
more
fewer
students
dollars.
with
Right,
fewer
yeah.
dollars.
Right.
Because we're providing less money in the grant program than we were before the budget cuts. We haven't gotten back to that. So sure, there's more money being put in, and we're already being talked. It's already the talk is that this next budget's going to be tighter.
Right.
Because that's what you do when you talk about budgets. It's going to be tighter. Well, we're not. I wonder, will we be even able to brag that we put more money into it after this next session, even when that more money doesn't bring us to where we were before?
Well, let's talk about the things that can. Okay,
Well, the point is, and yet enrollment and demand for enrollment continues to grow.
True.
We enroll more people. We have more young people in school, and plans to add a lot more. The truth is that as Kirk points out, pretty wealthy state. We can afford anything, but then comes the concern with how much more do we want to tax the people of the state of Texas? And as we know, the tolerance is pretty low.
Pretty low. And how are the dollars that are currently being appropriated or allocated being spent? And I want to come to that.
That's fair.
So the Lieutenant Governor got up and he said, look, there are several things that could be done before we start talking about increasing tuition. There are several things that the universities and the systems could do to rein in costs. First thing he said was we need to rein in administrative salaries. He thinks that he has said that salaries are getting to be out of control and that part of the costs that can be reined in easily would be reduced. I actually, the Tribune reported on this not long after his press conference. In the past 4 years, total pay has grown 70% for the leaders of Texas's 6 university systems and the presidents of those systems' namesake schools. This is UT Austin, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, University of North Texas, University of Houston, Texas State. In 2012, the average comp of the leaders of those schools was $565,000. In 2016, it's $955,000. There may be a good excuse for those salaries going up, but I don't begrudge anybody the opportunity to make more money, but God. I mean, just at a time when you're asking, it's a little bit like public ed complaining last week about the Supreme Court, and but we passed a $63 million bond issue in McKinney to build a football stadium. They may not be related. Those facts may not line up perfectly, but the optics are crap, right?
Yeah. I think that's right. Now, look, I don't know if you asked me to set the salaries, I'm not sure what I would set it at. I'd want to look at it. A, the optics are very bad. B, it seems to me to be a ton of money going into it. C, we talk about wanting to run government like a business. So one of the ways you get the best and brightest and retain the best and brightest is you pay. And
Right.
and frankly, I want the best and brightest running these institutions. So what is the appropriate balance? But that is an appropriate place to start.
Yeah.
There's an appropriate place to look. But let me just tell you, you cut every one of those salaries in that period of time.
You get nothing.
You're not.
Right, but the lieutenant governor has a general point that administrative costs have got to be a focus, not instructional costs.
Always.
Right.
But let's talk about the competitive nature of higher education. A couple of years ago, when the contract of the president of the University of Houston, President Chancellor of the University of Houston system came up, it was extremely competitive. There were institutions out of state for very good reason, wanted her
Well,
badly.
she's a significant figure nationally and internationally in higher ed, and there's going to be competition for her. Is there going to be competition for the best people?
Unquestionably. And so they had to pay more to keep her, and given the trajectory and the plans at the University of Houston, I would argue it's probably money well spent, and the state of Texas will be well served. The comparison, though, that interests me is that increase with the increase in instruction, the mission of the university itself.
Yeah.
The question is how much that money went to increases for administrators other than those leaders. I think that's important, and its comparison with pay for instruction, to me, looms large.
How about the general question of reining in costs? You know, again, John Sharp in testimony before your committee a couple weeks ago pointed out that at the moment A&M has got its administrative costs down to below 4%. There are other universities that would make a similar argument that we've really just basically
And they did.
And their response to you all would be, tell us specifically what more you want us to cut. We've already cut and cut. You pointed out that privatizing or outsourcing, again using A&M as an example, has generated some amount of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. They would say if they were sitting up here, what is it specifically that we're not doing that you want us to do?
And here's the way I would respond to that.
Yeah.
You're asking the right question. And one of the things that I worry happens in higher education, and we can't afford to let it happen. Go back to how I kind of started this about, I wish we were looking at how it was you build the best higher education system, and then back from that if you can't afford things. One of the problems we have is we allow just simple politics to dictate what's going on. As I watched those people at that hearing that we had the other day, talking about what they're doing to provide excellent higher education within the confines, and asking, frankly, without saying it out loud, the question you just asked, you know, what more do you want us to do? Too often what happens is those of us in the legislature, we just come up with something, and we say, here's what we think you ought to do, and they're the experts. We don't rely enough on them to tell us what we ought to do. It's instead, what can I put on my political brochure in the next campaign, and I'll tell you that's what you ought to do.
So you think that what's being made in this respect and in some other respects is a political rather than an economic argument?
I think too often we do that, and I think part of the reason you get focused on a single tree as opposed to the whole forest is the politics.
And I don't think that's untrue, and I think the worst thing in the world would be for the legislature to take upon itself to go in and tell people how to run those universities.
Micromanage.
There's a very essence
So we still do, despite all evidence to the contrary, we still do believe in local control.
Depends on who you mean by we.
It also depends
may
upon
just-
local, and it depends upon control.
It may just be you and me.
Right. Okay.
But the bigger government is not the answer to this. We rely on them to make those decisions.
Sharp's testimony before your committee, quote, maintaining and improving the quality of our education is more expensive today than it was in 2002, and that cost cannot be covered by efficiencies alone. His argument is we can find all the efficiencies in the world within the A&M system, and that's still not going to improve the quality of our education. You would agree with that?
I agree.
Yeah.
But have they done everything, or
Right.
have any of the institutions done
Right.
everything they can
Right.
to operate as economically as possible?
Senator Watson, Lieutenant Governor called for the end of tuition set-asides. That was one thing that he said he believed would save some money. He in fact said that that would allow potentially for the cost of tuition to be reduced by as much as 20%. You actually have a piece in the Tribune right now in which you argue that this is a bad idea. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, well, first of all, for those that don't know what tuition set-asides are, is back when deregulation, when the Lieutenant Governor just cut off my mic.
You know what? He is all powerful. That's
Yes.
right. Actually.
Oh, my
Yeah,
goodness.
right. Technically, it was probably Alan Blake. Who cut off.
Back in 2003, when the decision was being made to deregulate tuition, it wasn't lost on anybody that what was going to happen is tuition was going to go up. And they didn't want, the members of the legislature didn't want it to go up on the backs of middle-class families and students. So what they said is, you're going to take a portion of any increase in tuition that you make the increase. You know, we've got statutory, but what you do, you're going to take a portion of that and you're going to set it aside for purposes of helping low-income students. And it has worked. It has provided a lot of relief for these low-income students. It's not true that it would be 20%. I think that's just an inaccurate number, because it'd be more like, on a statewide basis,
I think you said it was like 7%.
like 7%.
7%, right, yeah.
Because keep in mind, you got different, some schools do tuition and fee, have added fees and that kind of thing. But when you do all the number crunching on it, it probably comes around to about 7%. Now that's 7% of tuition. And of course, tuition is just one part of the cost of college. You've got room, you've got book, you've got all these other things. So basically you're talking about, and I'm overstating this, but you're talking about beer money for somebody that can afford to be in a frat. What you're not doing.
Not unimportant.
I'm not arguing against it. I'm just talking about trying to put it in context.
There's that Dartmouth education.
Yeah, that's right.
Again,
I went to Baylor. We didn't do that.
Yeah,
But
sure you didn't.
But here's the thing. For example, at the University of Texas at Austin, well, first of all, 41% of the tuition set-asides went to kids whose families had a $0 expected family contribution to their education. Zero. At the University of Texas, because you have this amount of money that's part of it, kids and families making less than $60,000, that with tuition set-asides and other grants and scholarships and that kind of thing, they're actually paying zero in tuition and getting additional money. And that's basically the median family income. It'd be $197 million a year we get from tuition set-asides that's basically scholarship money.
Right.
And if we talk about doing away with it, are we going to, that's $400 million to buy any of it.
Watson thinks this is penny wise and pound foolish. Are you with him or with the Lieutenant Governor on this?
I'm with myself. But let's look at this. We don't want to assume that every family that is actually paying tuition is a well-heeled family. It's a big stretch for an awful lot of families, and simply taking money from one pocket and putting in the other, net doesn't get anybody else into college or make it affordable. And that's my problem. I think it's something of a distraction. If we end set-asides, does that mean that anybody going to college today is not going to go? Probably not, because that money is still going to the university, can still go to scholarship and instructional, and then once again, it's up to us.
But what's being said is do away. He says the money will still be going, but what they're saying is do away with it so that you can cut.
Right.
And now that's a big assumption that somehow that money is going to still be going. That would require the legislature to appropriate roughly $400 million to replace it.
Yep.
And sure, here's what it is. Some people call it a hidden tax.
Well, the Lieutenant Governor specifically
The
calls
truth
it
of the matter is, of course it's a tax. It was created to make up for what the legislature wasn't willing to do. It's a tax that is a directed and dedicated tax that is actually going to its dedicated purpose.
Which we
Unlike what
like.
happens,
Yes.
unlike what happens in the legislature, where you do a dedicated tax and appropriate it, and it doesn't go for it.
No one has yet said to me that we need to take that, set aside that 15% and simply reduce tuition by that much. I don't think that's in the offing.
Well,
It's a question of efficiency.
the lieutenant governor said explicitly in his press conference, end tuition set-asides, and you may be able to cut tuition by as much as 20%.
Maybe, but I don't think that it's going to work that
And
way.
that, okay, we're going to go to questions here in one second. I want to be sure we use the time. I mentioned earlier, you intend to introduce again in the next session a bill that would tie the ability to increase tuitions to some performance-based metrics.
Plus inflation.
Specifically, what would those metrics be? Like, what would the universities have to do to justify the increase in tuition?
4- and 6-year completion rates.
Right.
Degrees granted per 100 students.
Yeah.
All those certifications and areas.
Are you
where the
tying it to the
certifications-
60 by 30?
I think going forward, we'll do exactly that.
Are you satisfied now with the 6-year graduation rate at 4-year institutions, both on its own or compared to other states? Would the metrics that the schools are putting up now trigger those increases, or would they have to do better?
They would have to do better.
Right now, it's 53% according to the coordinating board's almanac. The 6-year graduation rate of 4-year institutions is 53%. We're ranked 32nd among all states. Can you put a number on where we'd have to be in your mind, to satisfy the Seliger performance-based metrics model?
The number yet? No. No, but we will have to, and we will going forward. And I think it's the way to do it. It means that the production is increasing, and I think that's going to cost and ought to drive more money.
Questions here. We have a microphone. We'll walk around. If you have a question, please put your hand up.
Paul's going.
Professor Steckler.
I want to talk about getting into the weeds on this, and unfortunately,
Sure.
it is the University of Texas, which may be a bad example. I'm the chair of the Radio, Television, Film Department. I've essentially been part of the budgetary process for 20 years, and I've been chairing for 6 years. Our peer institutions, USC, NYU, cost $50,000, $60,000.
Yep.
Okay, but we're one of the top 10 programs in the United States with much, much less resources.
Right.
Okay, we have a high degree of economic diversity. We have by far the highest Latino population of students, majors in the United States. And we're very dependent on an instructional budget. Now, nobody is assuming that the state is going to give UT substantially more funds in the next legislative session. And we're assuming that if tuition is not increased, instructional budget will be cut, and we'll have longer waiting lists. We're also being asked to take on more majors, which we're happy to do.
So, question.
The question is the state then going to be okay with the fact that our 4-year graduation rate is going to fall?
In some ways, this gets back, Senator Seliger, to Senator Watson's point earlier. You know, we in Texas like to puff our chests out and say we want to be first at everything and best at everything. There may not be Vermont exceptionalism or Idaho exceptionalism. There is absolutely Texas exceptionalism. Do we do enough to undergird that, to achieve all that we aspire to achieve or all that we brag about achieving? And are we going to be satisfied in the absence of that, as Professor Steckler is alluding to, with just accepting, we're just not going to be as good?
And I don't necessarily accept that. The university has announced that it is going to increase tuition, and so it will address that. Once again, it is up to us to support higher education. I think we'll be able to see some more money.
So are
going
you
to
saying
higher
that you're going to
education.
be cool with the university increasing tuition?
Not necessarily, but they've announced that they're going to.
Well, I can announce that I'm 6'9" and playing for the Oklahoma City Thunder, but that doesn't matter either. I mean, announcing is not the same. I mean, you guys are actually making an active attempt to block them from increasing tuition.
No, we're not.
You're not?
Absolutely not. We're trying to set a pathway to do it that's more productive and beneficial for
What
the
is the? I'm interested in this. So, what is the pathway based on the activities that you all have undertaken over the last couple of weeks? You have all but put up your finger and said, "Oh no, you didn't," to them. I mean, you have basically said to higher ed, "We reject your request for increased tuition," didn't you?
I don't know that that's been said at all. Right now, it's legal and they're doing it, but what we're talking about implementing is performance-based tuition increases, and I think that's a logical way to do it.
And in the absence of that legislation passing this session the way it didn't pass last session, what's going to happen?
They will increase tuition again in the next biennium, I assume.
So you're saying that in the absence of a thing that you would prefer, the universities, despite everything that we've heard over the last couple of weeks, are going to get to do what they want anyway. You just won't like it.
Absent any legislative action right now, that is what they can do.
You feel that's what's going to happen?
If that happens, it will be with lots and lots of screaming and threats that you better not do it.
Right, I mean,
And-
the
and that-
lieutenant
and that-
governor has made, we forget because the bathroom issue has interceded. But before the bathroom issue, the lieutenant governor was on a crusade on this topic like no other topic.
And see, where I agree with Kel from a technical and legal standpoint, if his bill doesn't pass and nothing else passes, what is allowed. But what I guess where I slightly disagree with him is that, you know, the University of Texas didn't do the raising of tuition year after year in large part because the threat that if you do this, we're going to come in and we're going to do other things to you. And that is a very real threat. Something thoughtful like the chairman's bill, which I supported last session, and intend to be supported.
support again.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see how it all ends up in specifics, but I supported him on that last session. That thoughtful approach doesn't always happen in the heat of a legislative session.
Right.
And what worries me is, back to Paul's point, is that, or Professor Steckler's point, the truth of the matter is, they're doing very well, both from how much they're able to spend and what the product they're providing is. But when you keep cutting at that and keep cutting at that,
Right.
even if it's just the threat, we're going to smack you if you don't do it exactly the way we're telling, even if we
Right.
can't pass legislation, we're going to do damage.
Yeah, but of course, you know, when Paul was talking, I can call him Paul. When Paul was asking his question, I was thinking he's making the argument for the people who think there shouldn't be an increase in tuition. Look at how well we're doing for so much less. He actually sounded like somebody arguing that there does not need to be a tuition increase. Really, it's only going to be when those streams cross that then people are going to start having a problem.
And that gets back to one of the points I was making earlier. A lot of this is about our perception of what we would like to see happen when the experts are really doing a pretty good job. And we ought to ask them more about how we achieve that goal as opposed to what we might put on a bumper sticker.
Good. Other questions? Hands up, and we'll be happy to welcome Mr. Malfaro and then Mr. Fitzpatrick in the front. Sir.
Good morning. I'm Louis Malfaro. I'm the president of the Texas American Federation of Teachers. So I want to go back to the bigger question around demographics in the state.
Yeah.
I attend every year the conference of HACU, which is the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities.
Right.
Many Texas universities are member organizations. In fact, I think UT El Paso grants more bachelor's degrees to Latino students than any university in the United States.
Correct.
So the president of HACU, after the big budget cutting that went on, not only in Texas, but in other states after 2011, asked a very pointed question about whether or not the political will to raise taxes to educate the rising Hispanic population exists in our states, and in particular, whether it exists in Texas. Is the argument that we need to get away from tuition set-asides, and even Senator Seliger, your contention that Texans just aren't willing to pay more taxes, although a lot of survey data argues for K-12 and higher ed that that is not the case. Is there really kind of a political question here about, are we committed to educating the, 850,000 kids who entered public schools in the last decade, 9 out of 10 of whom are kids of color, that are on their way to college in the next 10 years?
Ours is a political body, and to expect any part of that to be devoid of political considerations is not well informed. Are we committed to all students from everywhere and every ethnicity in Texas improving their lot and availing themselves of higher education? Absolutely. And that's why it's a substantial part of our budget.
But Mr. Malfaro refers to the demographic component of this. I looked up before coming out here today the enrollment by race and ethnicity in higher ed in Texas in 2015. It's 37% white. This is in Texas. 37% white, 35% Hispanic, 14% African American. You know where those numbers are headed.
Sure.
So the challenges for the state on higher ed, on every area of publicly funded, public ed, transportation, kind of go down the list. The demographic inevitability conversation is going to obviously drive the future conversation we might be having in 5 years or 10 years
Sure.
on this stage. So what does that do to how you think about this issue going forward? Do you think to yourself, what we're doing now is adequate, but in 10 years or in 20 years or by 2050, when according to Steve Murdoch, the state will be more than 55% Hispanic, down to about 32% Anglo, does that change the way that you think about what we need to be doing today?
No. We still want an educated and well-trained workforce and population and need to work toward that. And I think that the UTEP statistic is a particularly useful one because we have institutions within systems that are doing just that.
Right.
They're working very hard to address that demographic.
Senator Watson, should the demographic conversation be, for the future, be driving the conversation about budgeting and policy today?
It has to, and if you look at, for example, let's go back to 60 by 30 techs, and you look at what is the pipeline and what you're going to need to do in order to achieve
Right.
that goal, it will be driven by it will, in fact, be driven by demographics.
And let's say
I
for
think
the
it'd be driven more by economics.
Well, let's say for the benefit of people here, so the 60 by 30 goal, I mean, there's several pieces of 60 by 30. 60 by 30 says that 60% of Texans 25 to 34 will achieve some kind of post-secondary degree or certificate
2030.
by 2030. That's the 60 by 30. Currently, that percentage is right now about 40%.
Right.
And if you look at the 8th grade cohort data that tracks kids who enter 8th grade in Texas public schools 6 years out, a new set of those numbers just came out from the coordinating board. We're still stuck at about 20%. So 6 years out of high school, 1 in 5 kids in Texas end up with some kind of post-secondary degree or certificate. If you're African American or Hispanic, it's like 1 in 9. And if you're low socioeconomic status, regardless of race, it's like 1 in 10. We have a long way to go, do we not, to get to that 60 by 30 number?
And then when you, we do. And
Yeah.
when you look at both K through 12, and that the pipeline that's coming to help make up that
Yeah.
60 by 30, and you look at current higher ed demographics and economics, if we don't, we have to focus on it, and what that means in terms of the overall discussion about financing is you're going to be calling upon the universities and the colleges to do more in order to have kids and students ready to meet the 4 years and 6 year graduation rates and those kinds of things. They're going to need, it's just going to take more money. Commissioner Paredes says that the two biggest reasons you see dropout, and he calls them both primary reasons. One is the number of students that get into higher ed that aren't ready to be in higher ed. That means we have to put money into getting them up to speed.
Yep.
Which is a good, you wish they were ready, but we need to do that. The second is being economically disadvantaged, which means we're going to need to help them with finances to get through. That's just going to take money.
Right. Mr. Fitzpatrick will be the last question, sir.
Well, thanks for this fantastic discussion, Evan, and thanks for you guys being here. 53% is the figure that Evan cited. If we were talking about that for a high school, we'd be outraged.
Right.
When you talk about half not graduating in 4 or 6 years, how do you think about that?
Right.
And especially knowing that, it's probably not going to be kids like mine, or like me that could, afford the beer money. It's disproportionately the demographics. And it's also really different probably at University of Texas or Texas A&M and Baylor versus West Texas A&M or Texas State. So do you think, with all the discussion and everything you're talking about, that what colleges and universities and external groups are doing is going to materially change that 53%, whether it's more money or less money amount around the edges? Or is it going to take something different that either you've seen or you've heard of? Because 53% to me, we're not talking about that.
And really, maybe let me reframe slightly. Where is the outrage over that, if in fact it were the high school graduation rate? And for that matter, there's enormous outrage over public ed not being funded enough. That was the basis for the lawsuit, and there are parents and school boards storming the Capitol with pitchforks and torches over public ed funding. I'm not aware of any such activity happening on higher ed. So Senator Watson first and Senator Seliger, why are we accepting that and what do we have to do to fix it?
I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. I think our outrage is only directed into the school, right? We're not outraged that maybe we're not doing enough, both as a member of the legislature and as a state, to change those numbers. And instead, our outrage is directed at the schools that are generally, as we've talked about, doing a pretty good job with what they've got trying to achieve that. And we get outraged and say, you're not doing enough, so we're going to cut you even more. You're not doing enough, so we're going to not let you raise tuition. And I'll go back to where I started. I wish that what we would do is begin the debate with what are the maximums we could achieve, as opposed to the minimums we're willing to settle for. Right. And too often, that's what it all becomes a discussion about, because we start with the debate, we start with the discussion about, I don't want to finance you, I don't want to hear something that might cost more money, and I'm not even going to engage in what could be a great debate in that regard.
Yeah. Senator Seliger, what about that?
Clearly, we're told all the time that we underfund higher education, as we are told that we underfund public education, transportation, healthcare, criminal justice. Take your pick. I'm optimistic of 60 by 30 because we spend a lot of time talking about K through 12 to secondary education alignment, and the gains that we have seen with dual credit and early college high school, which I think is an absolute game changer in the state of Texas. We're going to have a substantial number of young people graduate from high school with a diploma, an associate's degree, and a certification. And I think it's one of the real great spots in education. We still don't, we don't want to get into this deal that we're not funding higher education or things like that. Can we put some more funding in? Yes. Can higher education do a better job making dollars go farther? Yes. Are we using all the elements of higher education that we possibly can? In this case, including community colleges, most certainly. So, yeah, I think it's a lofty goal, but I think that we can get there.
Okay. Good conversation. I really appreciate so much Chairman Seliger and Senator Watson joining us, as well as all of you. Please give them a big hand. Thank you all very much. We'll see you again hopefully next week or sometime soon. Thank you.